Welcome to Early Returns, hosted by Jan Barron, a partner of Holtzman Vogel. This podcast examines law and politics and seeks insights from political players in elections, lobbying, media, and the law. Now, let's join our host, Jan Barron.
Welcome to Early Returns, a podcast about law and politics. My goal is to learn more about the legal issues that often arise from campaigns and elections and about the people who might be involved. Our guest today is someone who must police an important and constitutionally sensitive area of politics, the raising and spending of money to finance campaigns for public office. That is the job of the Federal Election Commission. And Chair Dickerson is one of the 6 FEC commissioners. This year, as of last month, he became the chairman of the FEC, a term that's going to last for the rest of this election year. Alan, thank you for joining us and welcome to Early Returns.
It's a pleasure to be here and I appreciate the invitation.
Before we get into all the nitty-gritty about some of the legal disputes and activities that might be going on at the Federal Election Commission, I think it'd be helpful for our listeners to learn a little bit more about you, perhaps more than what's already on your resume on the FEC website or on our podcast website. I assume even though you live and work in Washington, D.C., that's not where you came from. It's not where you grew up. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and where you started and how you wound up here?
I think you're right, Jan. I think there's some sort of unofficial rule that official biographies in the federal government be as dry and dull as possible. So I am not from the East Coast. In fact, I'm the first member of my family to live on the East Coast in, I suppose, recorded history. My family came the other direction. So my parents met and married in Hawaii, and I grew up in the California Mojave Desert where my father worked at Edwards Air Force Base. So I grew up with long vistas and dry weather and nary the hint of snow unless you went up into the mountains. And then I'd spent several of my summers back home with the extended family, 5 generations deep in the islands, all of which is very, very different from Washington, as you know, but I think did give me a somewhat different cultural appreciation for how different things are out here. I was out there until I was 17, and then I came east for college, as so many Westerners do. One thing led to another, and skipping from there to New York to DC, I landed eventually in the government.
In terms of law school, when you decided to go to law school, were you planning on being an election lawyer or an expert on law and politics?
Not remotely. I think if you had pressed me in my senior year of college, I wouldn't have been able to give you a coherent answer as to what campaign finance law was, let alone that I wanted to spend my career doing it. My first love was military law and national security issues and foreign policy. So that's what I studied undergrad. And when I went to law school, I actually decided to go to NYU in New York precisely because of the strength of the international law program where I did a great deal of my work.
So you entered the military upon graduation from college or law school?
Neither. I entered the military more than a decade later. The story on that is that I'm sure a lot of lawyers will be listening to this, and it's quite common, and was certainly common then, to spend your second summer in law school, your first summer doing something fun and interesting, and your second summer at a firm with the expectation of eventually getting a job there and paying off your student loans. I did not do that. Rather, I spent my second summer at the Pentagon, and I quickly realized that it was going to take me, 10 or 15 years to get the job that I had as an intern in law school if I went the military route, just because of the rank progress and the structure of all of it. And so I switched gears. I eventually joined the Army JAG Corps, my joke being that they have somewhat lower standards, as a 35-year-old practicing campaign finance lawyer. I was the old man running around the track with all the 24-year-olds.
And is this an active duty obligation or a reserve type obligation? And what's your rank? You're in the JAG Corps now, right?
I am. I'm a captain, Army side. It's solely a reserve obligation. It'd be even more awkward if there were an active duty component obligation given my current day job.
Well, after law school, you did a stint in private practice, as I recall. Where was that and with what firm?
It was in New York City. I stayed in the city after law school. First at O'Melveny & Myers and then at Kirkland & Ellis. At both, I, again, did not practice political law. I was mostly doing commercial litigation, white-collar defense, those sort of matters. which is occasionally useful in this line of work to have done some white collar defense, to have defended against a different agency, and to have some basic background in securities law, just because these things do occasionally crop up in the political law bar. It's been a useful cross-training sort of opportunity as a young man.
I would think that doing any work in white-collar criminal defense would be excellent preparation for political lawyers. I do recall there was once a chief counsel at the Senate Ethics Committee who spent many years as a prosecutor in Manhattan, focusing on organized crime. I always thought that was excellent training in trying to impose ethical rules on senators in the United States Senate. After private practice, eventually, I gather, that's when you started doing something that was related to political law. How did that come about, and what was it?
Well, it's a very Washington story. It was complete happenstance. I'd been up in New York as a fifth-year associate and was sort of looking to do something else. Moved down to Washington and started looking around. I took a counsel position at a small firm doing litigation to pay the rent. And that left me enough time to start volunteering and talking to people, trying to find a place here in the Capitol. And so I originally revisited the game plan from law school. I did some volunteer work for the National Institute of Military Justice. They actually sent me down to Guantanamo Bay as an NGO observer, did some writing, and I applied on the Hill, as one does. My resume, this is the Washington part of the story, my resume bounced around the Hill from member to committee to member. And then one day I got a call just completely out of the blue from the general counsel of the Republican Governors Association. And it was the 2010 cycle. And the 2010 cycle was especially busy at the state level. There were a large number of governorships up. He asked if I would be interested in coming and joining the legal team there for the cycle. And I said, yes. It sounded like an adventure, an area of the law I didn't really know. That experience hooked me. Looking at 30-something states' laws in this area, getting to really read Buckley and McConnell and the foundational documents for the first time. It was fascinating. I got to really dig into it in the context of an ongoing campaign, multiple ongoing campaigns with very different law and very different regulatory bodies that we're dealing with. As part of that experience, I would go into my boss's office from time to time and I'd bring in some state statute that hadn't been updated. And I would say some version of, this isn't my opinion that this is unconstitutional. I just read Buckley and this isn't a close call. They just didn't update the statute. We should do something about this. And whether they did or didn't, it's neither here nor there. But I think I got a little bit of a reputation as someone who wanted to go out and try to get some of the underbrush cleared.
For the benefit of some of our listeners who may not be familiar with the Republican Governors Association, the RGA, it's not a lobbying organization or a legal organization, is it? It's in the campaign business, isn't it? How would you describe it?
It's a 527. It does independent work on behalf of Republican candidates for governor. I think that's part of what made it interesting is that a lot of people come to this line of work from the major national committees or from a major federal campaign. And I think that's a great background. And I, from time to time, wish I had that background. So I've had to hire people, which is kind of how this town works. I thought it was really fascinating to come at it from the state standpoint. It's informed my view of the commission in that a lot of what happens at the state level is this interesting interaction between sort of homegrown political climate and efforts by the legislature and the governor to respond to facts on the ground in those states. And all of that's happening against the backdrop of the federal system. You get these very interesting conversations between federal law and state law in these campaigns, where the state has reacted in some way to the federal constitutional structure. Many states, would just adopt FEC interpretations of the law, and many states didn't. They would take a very different approach. My first look at the campaign finance ecosystem was this maelstrom of swirling interpretations from state to state, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was kind of a different perspective than a purely federal-centric one.
That may be a good way of starting to distinguish between the Federal Election Commission and other agencies. And the Federal Election Commission, of course, regulates campaign finance at the federal level, which means the House and the Senate and presidential campaigns. And each state, of course, regulates its own campaigns, whether it's for governor or mayor or county commissioner. So the experience at the Republican Governors Association exposed you theoretically and potentially to at least 50 jurisdictions, all 50 states. If you throw in the District of Columbia, that's 51st jurisdiction with its own rules. But from the RGA, you then spent some 10 years working for a nonprofit organization that actually was not a political committee and was very active on the policy side of campaign finance and election law.
That's right. At the end of the 2010 cycle, I left the RGA, as you do at the end of the cycle, and what was then called the Center for Competitive Politics, which was founded by one of my predecessors at the commission, Brad Smith, who's probably familiar to a number of people listening to this. Brad had started this nonprofit right after he left the FEC. And they were looking for someone to take the helm of a litigation practice there. And I never had this good a job before. I probably never will again. It was an absolute joy to just be handed the reins of a really ambitious project of trying to bring the court cases that were going to liberalize and rationalize campaign finance law. I took over in 2011, so it was right in the aftermath of Citizens United. And for everyone who remembers those days, it was a really interesting, heady intellectual debate about what the scope of the case was, where we were, what remained, what didn't. And so I spent 10 years on that work, not just in litigation, all across the country, little state capitals, federal courts of appeal, everything in between, which was a delight. And, also on the policy side, testifying and writing.
How much of that work would have interacted with the Federal Election Commission, perhaps its lawyers and litigators? Is that the majority of your experience, or was it a minority of your experience?
I'd say it probably was half and half, both in the sense that the FEC is the big player in this space, and we obviously engaged with a fair amount. And, the fact that our chairman had been on the commission, I think also gave us some perspective on it and a desire to be involved with the work of the commission. But at the same time, I hadn't come from that world. I was coming at this with better knowledge of the state systems. A lot of the interesting constitutional questions were down at the state level. One of the interesting things about the interaction between the federal and the state systems is that in general, the federal system, I think, just is a little bit clearer. You have a large federal bureaucracy stocked with smart people who answer questions and develop the law. There's a lot of prolix pages of the reports that get created by that process, but there's also a lot of answers to questions. You go down to even a mid-sized state, and quite often you've got a part-time regulator, you've got a legislature that hasn't looked at the question in years and years, and you just have a lot of uncertainty. And so I'd say our time was kind of divided between those two worlds, depending on where we thought we could have the biggest impact.
By the time you got to the Federal Election Commission itself as a commissioner, which would have been in December of 2020, correct? You had some insight into the commission, how it worked. Many of the issues were current during your 10 plus years at the Institute for Free Speech. But the agency itself in December of 2020 had some relatively unique dynamics going on. For example, for the previous 2 years, it had no quorum of commissioners. Just to summarize quickly, the Federal Election Commission has 6 seats, 6 commissioners. In order for the agency to actually make any substantive decisions, there must be a vote of at least 4 commissioners. And for a period of almost 2 years with a short 2-week gap, there were only 3 commissioners, and therefore they couldn't vote on advisory opinions, couldn't vote on enforcement matters or regulations for that matter. So that was sort of interesting dynamic, number one. And then number two, you arrived in the midst of a pandemic, and the agency had been closed to the public and to its operations generally as March of 2020 and is still closed technically. What was that like going on the commission at that time under those circumstances?
Let's start with the obvious. The whole appointment and confirmation process was very surreal. It was the middle of the pandemic. It was an election year. There was a lot of movement and there were a lot of new faces. I sometimes remind people that a majority of the commission, 4 of us, have been there for less than 2 years. It's a very new commission in a lot of ways. And that was the first sort of taste of it, was 3 of us came in December. My Republican colleague, Sean Cooksey, and my Democratic colleague, Sean Broussard. We didn't get the sort of shake hands in the hallway and show up to the formal hearing and sit at the table together. That's not how it was done. It was all done remotely. You had to make the decision to make phone calls. That carried through. We did the remote confirmation process, which I don't recommend. I think there's some real advantages to the old process of going and shaking hands and talking to people and being in the same room together.
Had you met all of your fellow commissioners by the time you became a commissioner in person?
I had never met either of the commissioners who I was confirmed with in my life in person. We'd spoken on the phone. We'd seen each other over screens during the hearing. That was a very strange dynamic once we were confirmed together, because immediately Shauna Broussard became chair of the commission and I became vice chair. And she and I were expected to run this place. And, we were brand new to the building. She had worked there for a long time, so she knew a lot of people. But you had 3 new Republicans who had not worked in the commission. I knew most of the litigation staff because I'd been in court against them for 10 years. So I had that advantage. I knew the people that I'd litigated against and had pretty good and cordial relationships with them. But my lament was that I didn't get to do the thing where you walk the halls and sort of shake hands with people and chat, see the pictures of their kids, and just have the basic human interaction that makes organizations work.
How do you think that affects the efficiency of the agency, not to mention the collegiality of all the people?
I think it's horribly inefficient, at least at my level. I don't necessarily mean this as a broader comment on human nature, but in government, in a commission that is explicitly structured to be divided between the major parties in a way that requires compromise, requires bipartisan agreement before significant actions are taken, where that's the structure of the job. I think it's much more difficult if you can't have those sort of casual conversations, those casual relationship building. I'll say this isn't just me. I think all of my colleagues have shared this priority, but it was a requirement to prioritize making the phone calls and forming the relationships because it wasn't happening organically.
What about for private citizens who may have matters pending before the agency during your time on the commission? I assume that, I know that there have been advisory opinions issued. As part of the advisory opinion process, usually somebody representing the person who asked the questions can appear in person before the commissioners. I assume all that is done remotely and online. And then, of course, there are not many opportunities for the public to see and meet any of the commissioners other than public meetings and, in rare instances, hearings, whether they're rulemaking hearings or enforcement proceedings where there might be a probable cause hearing. Have you had many of those in your time on the commission? And what's it like dealing with the regulated community so remotely?
It's a challenge. I imagine it's also hard for the community in the sense that increasingly we've gotten explicit requests to have things in person. And I think this may just be me because I'm an old litigator. I think there's something difficult to capture, but nonetheless very real and very important about being in person, about that moment where the right to be heard is a right to be heard face to face, that the government has that obligation of transparency. And so I think it's been very challenging to have this much more artificial screen-based way of talking to each other. And I hear that frustration from others who are looking to appear before the commission. I think it's been lamentable. And I'm very hopeful that in the next few months, we'll be able to move away from that and back towards in-person events, both because, as I said, I think that right to be heard is key and ancient and hard fought, but also because the dynamic, I think, is important. Watching the commissioners in person deal with the matter together at the table, I think, is something we owe the American people in terms of that transparency to our thought process and our dynamic.
Well, aside from these unique dynamics of having to do so much work without in-person interaction, in terms of the substantive work that you've experienced in your 1 year plus on the agency, were there substantive surprises, in terms of the decision-making process, arguments, how things get done, notwithstanding the fact that you've been exposed to the agency through your prior work? Any surprises along those lines?
A number. I've been exposed to the agency through the regulatory process, through litigation. I didn't have a background really in the enforcement side. My biggest surprise was just when I was appointed, I went back and I read the whole act, top to bottom, as amended. It had been a while. When you're practicing, you hone in on the parts that are important. So I read all the act, I looked at the regulations, I did this whole thing. And then I got to the commission, and it was amazing to me how much just accreted custom was important. And I'm a conservative. I'm comfortable with accreted wisdom as a general concept. But the FEC isn't that old. This is a post-Watergate 40-something-year-old agency. It's not the State Department. It's not the Supreme Court. It's not one of these sort of hoary agencies that have had centuries and generations to accrete stuff. Nevertheless, there was a lot of that I had to learn, a lot of just informal practices and formalized guidance that looks very strange if you squint at it with fresh eyes. I think it's been a challenge for the staff and probably a healthy thing that with 4 new commissioners coming on with fresh eyes and with very different perspectives on the agency, we're getting to take a second look at some of that accreted wisdom.
Have there been some changes as a result of this new blood and reevaluation of some of the practices and procedures? And if so, what are they?
I think so. One of my biggest surprises was just going back to what I said earlier. You've got 4 new commissioners. More or less, we've got 2 commissioners that have been there for a long time and know the place well and have their views, but you've got 4 new faces who have to run this place. And it was surprising to me how little changed at first, how sort of the inertia of the system carried forward despite what I would have thought would be kind of a shock to the system. But there have been a lot of little things just in terms of a lot of it's just paperwork, sort of the workflow and how we've managed that. I think there's been an appetite to streamline it among the new commissioners, partially driven by the massive backlog of enforcement actions we inherited. I've put a couple things on open meetings in an attempt to do small, useful projects that I thought would have unanimous agreement among the commissioners. We're going to talk about one tomorrow, which is efforts to streamline our interactions with the State Department when there are foreign states that are brought in front of the commission, just because that's not really our expertise, but what we do does implicate the responsibilities of the United States internationally. We had a unanimous vote to ask OGC, the Office of General Counsel, to look at getting a form out for super PACs. It's been 12 years. I think those of us who had not been at the commission for that period sort of found it perplexing that the commission had not taken the fairly basic ministerial act of creating a form.
Do you think that having an unanimous vote to create a new government form is the biggest accomplishment of the agency in the last year plus?
I'm laughing because I understand how that sounds. No, I don't. I think it's a useful metric. I think it's something that's productive. I think the biggest accomplishment has just been the nuts and bolts of making the place work. We had a long period without a quorum. People don't talk about it, but a much longer period without a full commission. And suddenly we have a full slate of 6 commissioners, new relationships, new perspectives. We inherited a lot of work because, as you mentioned, we had 2 years and much of it the 2016 election where we were not able to act on these matters. And so I think the biggest accomplishment has just been the nuts and bolts of clearing that brush. And I've given, and I'll say it again, I've given my predecessor's chair, Shonda Broussard, a lot of credit for that. She came out of the enforcement background, and she and I committed very early on to working very closely together across the parties to see that that got done, and that the fact that there are deep disagreements about the law did not cripple the ability of the agency to do its core functions. And I think that was a really useful breakthrough. And I think it did a lot for the credibility of the agency.
As I mentioned earlier, under the statute, it takes 4 votes to do anything substantive. And when it comes to some matters, even with a full complement of commissioners, all 6 commissioners, there seems to be a pattern of 3-3 votes on certain matters, particularly in the enforcement area. And one of the things about the Federal Election Commission that makes it somewhat unique among some agencies, it represents itself in litigation, except for the Supreme Court of the United States, where it's represented by the Solicitor General. And some of these 3-3 deadlocks are on whether the commission should actually even appear in court when it is a party. What is your observation about that phenomena, which is relatively recent, even for the commission itself?
Well, it sincerely saddens me as a litigator. I think it's very unfortunate that the government of the United States is defaulting in federal court. And a couple observations. One is, I'm not sure that people outside of the small bubble of FEC watchers understand how strange this is. It's almost unthinkable for a federal agency to default. I've looked and I have been able to find very few examples outside of the FEC context where this has ever happened. And where it has, it's really unusual facts, like a lawyer down in Puerto Rico for the government just didn't file paperwork. It's not a considered position of an organ of the federal government to just not show up in response to court summons. That's shocking to those of us who have dealt with the federal courts.
What's the reaction from the judges, from the courts? Do they have any?
They're perplexed. They think we lost the paperwork. They cannot imagine. Unfortunately, it's now becoming normalized, which I think is really sad. But especially early on, the judges had no idea what to make. And this, regardless of who appointed the judge or their judicial philosophies, this was just procedurally bizarre and embarrassing. So yes, I think they're losing patience. That's my professional opinion, reading some of what the judges have written. I think that it's a really unfortunate path that we've gone down. And I think it's worth remembering, and this is maybe a hopeful note, I think it's important to be an optimist in a job like this. I think that people need to remember how recent this is, and that the decision of the FEC to deadlock on decisions to appear before agencies or to close files that had already been handled in the enforcement process is extremely new. It is a function of a long period of disagreements, some of which got very heated among prior commissioners. I do not think it reflects the current dynamic among the commissioners today. I think it's a really bad strategy that grew out of a very different context. And I remain hopeful that as the new commissioners discuss this amongst ourselves and as new commissioners join over time, and again, as the courts and the Congress probably start losing patience with this, that this will hopefully be a blip in an otherwise successful story of the FEC.
Has there been any Court of Appeals commentary or decisions? I think, to my knowledge, all of those types of cases, and there are not many, but they're a growing number, they've all been handled by the district courts and just federal district court judges. Any Court of Appeals review of these types of instances where the commission was a party but failed to appear?
No, that issue hasn't reached the Court of Appeals. I suspect, and reasonable minds can read the tea leaves differently, but the DC Circuit in particular knows the drill. The DC Circuit has ruled for decades that the commission's going to deadlock. It's structurally designed where you need bipartisan buy-in. And there are going to be cases where there isn't bipartisan buy-in. And there's a whole body of law on how you deal with that. And none of that's new. And I suspect that the decision not to show up in court in some of these cases is an unwillingness to accept that the law is settled, that the commission is entitled to deadlock. I'm curious to see what the Court of Appeals will eventually do with this.
Well, there is one case pending at the Supreme Court these days, brought by Senator Ted Cruz. There have been arguments already. Maybe you could just summarize what the issue is there and whatever commentary you have about that particular case, if appropriate.
I appreciate that, Jan. I have to be a little careful. The issue is public. The issue is that Senator Cruz loaned his campaign a sum of money. And under the law, both statutory and regulatory, he's only allowed to pay himself back a certain amount of that. And he has taken the position, and he won in district court on this argument, that the prohibition on him paying himself back for this loan from funds that are raised after the election is unconstitutional because it chills the ability of candidates to loan themselves money, and by extension of less well-resourced candidates in the sense of having large name recognition, the ability to raise money the old-fashioned way, to get started in races. And that prohibition doesn't do enough, if anything, to advance the government's anti-corruption interest. That's the heart of the case. A 3-judge district court in DC unanimously ruled that he was correct. And under a somewhat unusual procedure, he was able to appeal directly to the Supreme Court, which heard arguments fairly recently.
Well, that would be a case, if the Supreme Court agrees with the 3-judge court, of yet another provision of the fabled McCain-Feingold law being declared unconstitutional or simply inoperable. That kind of leads me to raise the question, particularly in light of your 10 plus years experience of litigating in this area, and now as a commissioner, this area of regulating money in politics has changed and is continuing to change in the sense that restrictions and rules, particularly spending limits, limitations on what candidates can do with their own resources. And in light of the fact that we now are in the age where Senate candidates, even challengers, as of the current election and last election of 2020, are raising in excess of $100 million for their campaigns, much of which is in the form of small donor contributions enabled by internet fundraising. Where is all this headed? What is the future of regulating money in politics, you think?
I think that the lesson, and you doubtless have your own views as a long-time observer of this, Jan, But my sense of the history of this is that the law and the regulatory response has tended to trail the market. I'll give you an example. When I teach Citizens United, as I sometimes do at law schools, I always assign the dissent because partially I think Justice Stevens is entitled to that respect, and partially because it's an interesting artifact of its time. The debate in Citizens United between the majority and the dissent is a debate about General Motors spending its entire treasury to flood the field and buy an election. And we've had 12 years of experience. And if you read that as a professional in this area, it sounds bonkers. That is not how any of this has developed. And so I think you have this trend where you have a big moment, everyone fights over what the law is or should be, and then the people have their say. And it doesn't develop remotely the way that people predicted. And so I think you're right. Not only is Citizens United's dissent incorrect in its assumptions of how campaigns would be funded, I don't think anyone in 2010, probably some people did, and they probably make a lot more than I do. Not many people in the larger constitutional debate foresaw the ways in which like a Bernie Sanders, who in 2010 was not a major figure, would be able to raise enormous amounts of money in small amounts from ordinary Americans. The debate is very strange in that if you talk to some of my colleagues even, who still think that, big money in politics, corporations are evil, go down the list of sort of talking points that are a decade old, it bears very little resemblance to the facts on the ground. And so my first prediction is that, as it has before, the law will follow the facts on the ground and not the heated rhetoric that is divorced from those facts. And the second is that I think we may be coming on a period of comparative stability in the law. You had this after Buckley when, for years, there are definitely skirmishes. There's all sorts of vague terms that reasonable people of good intentions are going to fight over. But you get answers to the vagueness over time. And unless you have big shocks to the system, you reach an understanding of what the law is. You may not like it. You may fight to change it. McCain-Feingold came out of such a fight. But everyone understood what the law was going into McCain-Feingold. And I think we may be coming up on that. I think the decision you just talked about in Cruz, regardless of how it comes down, is not going to have the sea-changing impact that a McConnell or a Buckley or a Citizens United did. I think there's that the Bonta decision, Americans for Prosperity Foundation versus Bonta, I think was in some ways a very simple case in that the Supreme Court said, all of this law we've developed about campaign finance, it's just about campaign finance. It's not going to run overall First Amendment doctrine. Maybe some of that will bleed over. I think the lower courts are going to have a very interesting and challenging job in applying that in cases that are on the line between campaign finance and other forms of nonprofit regulation. But I think that we may be reaching a point where people are tired of the big fights and want clear rules of the road and want to move forward and fight elections the way they, at least in my view, should be fought, which is on differences of opinion on how the government should run and not on the sort of procedural fights of who knows who and who gave money to whom, which I think has always been maybe less salient than some of the big fights about campaign finance law. What might lead one to believe?
Two comments to add to your excellent analysis, which is number one, an area of regulation that has been consistently upheld by the Supreme Court pertains to disclosure and transparency. That has started in Buckley versus Vallejo and continued through Citizens United, where there were challenges to disclosure and disclaimer regulation. And even the Citizens United court upheld the provisions of the act. And this American Prosperity versus Bonza case is kind of the first indication that there may be a limitation on government-mandated disclosure of supporters and contributors. And it is not necessarily in a campaign finance election context. So regulation seems to be shifted over to that point. And with respect to your observation about the dissent in Citizens United and the notion that a company like General Motors is going to devote all of their capital and resources to engage in independent spending, Justice Stevens should have known better than that, because an amicus brief that I filed on behalf of the Chamber of Commerce, which was cited in the Citizens United case and actually cited by Justice Stevens himself, spent a great deal of the brief focusing on the fact that while it was illegal under federal law to use corporate money to finance independent expenditure. It was completely legal and had been for decades in certain jurisdictions, including a large state jurisdiction like California. And we presented statistics that showed that there was no unleashing of corporate treasury money in any of those very important, well-funded campaigns. To the extent the business community spent any of its money, it was at least number 4 in terms of the participants who spent money, most of whom were wealthy individuals and unions, and in some cases, Native American Indian tribes. There was no history before Citizens United of an unleashing of corporate money that swamped the debate, and as you observed, none since then.
And I think if anyone had ever represented a corporation, that opinion felt strange. If you'd ever been in front of the Delaware Court of Chancery or the Delaware Supreme Court or applied the rules of Delaware corporate law, or you'd ever reviewed a 10K filing, the idea of a C-suite making the strategic decisions, they weren't going to care about what the FEC did. They were going to care about the shareholder derivative suits. They were going to care about the SEC enforcement. It always felt very strange and siloed in an odd way to me that we had these big predictions that just made no sense in any other area of the law. And I'm hopeful that the bar is developing a little more cohesive view of how these things work, because it was just such a strange opinion to read for the first time as someone who wasn't from this space.
I agree, and I think that's particularly true of publicly owned corporations. I think there is evidence that privately held companies and entities may be participating, but usually it's not even directly participating. It would be via donations to super PACs and other nonprofit organizations. And even then, that's really not where the big money is coming from. It's actually coming from ideologically driven, wealthy individuals who, before Citizens United, could have spent similar amounts on their own, even under the federal law. Well, Chairman Dickerson, I really appreciate you coming on this program. I'm going to ask you one question that may be entirely unrelated to everything we've discussed up to this point, but I always find it useful to learn from a guest what, if anything, they might be reading and any books that they might recommend, whether they're law and politics or any other topic of their interest.
I appreciate that. I'm an old Aristotelian, so I'm not sure I see a clear distinction between human nature and politics, but I'm actually currently reading Moby Dick just because I try to reread the classics regularly, and it just felt like the year to revisit something from our own shores. There probably are extended metaphors one could make about being at small agencies hunting white whales, but I'll leave that to your listeners' imagination. In terms of things in this space, directly and not metaphorically, I've been actually reading a book by a friend of mine, Joshua Chernus, who teaches political theory at Georgetown. And he wrote a book on the problems of liberalism in difficult political times. It's called Liberalism in Dark Times. One of his big lessons is the importance of an ethos that is somewhat forgiving of differences of opinion, that tries to develop a habit of mind of openness to the other side, that is not too ruthless in its politics. And leaving aside the fact that a close friend wrote it, so factor in your conflicts of interest. I have felt that to be a very useful lesson in these particular times and in a job that's in the center of some of these fights. And then the other, I'd be remiss if I didn't make a plug for it, but two other friends and fellow travelers, David Primo and Jeff Emilio, who are both professors. And I suspect you certainly, Jan, and certainly others may be familiar with them. They had a book a couple of years ago called Campaign Finance in American Democracy, where they talk about some of these disconnects between the rhetoric and the assumptions of how Americans deal with this very esoteric and complicated area of the law, and the assumption versus the reality. And they're tenured political scientists, and they did the research and they did it right. I found it very useful. It came out right at the tail end of my litigation time. But I think it's a useful tonic to what can be kind of an echo chambery conversation.
Well, thank you so much for those suggestions, especially Moby Dick. Might be worth reading, not just for commissioners looking for the white whale, but campaign finance reformers might want to revisit Moby Dick and see whether their hunt for reform and getting money out of politics is all that is cracked up to be. Again, thank you, Chairman Dickerson. I appreciate your time here. We look forward to our next episode of Early Returns.
Thank you, Jan.
Thanks for joining Early Returns, Law and Politics with Jan Barron. We hope you will join us for future episodes, which will continue to bring you voices and insights from the people engaged in our political landscape.